The story opens on a busy city street where a group of homeless people are gathered. The protagonist, an unassuming man with a grizzled beard and worn clothing, quietly sits among them. The city's pulse continues, oblivious to the quiet struggle of its most vulnerable inhabitants. But when two racist cops arrive, they make it clear that they don't see him as just another homeless man. Unbeknownst to them, the man they are about to harass and kidnap is a former Delta Force commander. His past, a lifetime of combat and discipline, has left him with the skill to survive. But nothing has prepared him for this kind of attack. "Move along, you're blocking the sidewalk." The voice rang out harshly, cutting through the sounds of the busy city street like a knife. Two uniformed officers strode toward a small group of homeless men and women huddled together by the corner, their eyes cold and disinterested. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the concrete, and the street was bustling with commuters heading home after a long day. But here, on the fringes of the city, the group of homeless people felt like ghosts, ignored by the world that passed. Then by among them sat Elijah. His weathered face was obscured by a thick beard, and his clothes were torn and stained from years of hardship. His eyes were distant, scanning the crowds with a quiet wariness. He had seen the worst of what life could offer, having once been part of an elite force, a member of Delta Force, before life had taken its toll. The streets were not the life he had chosen, but they were the life he had been handed. As the officers approached, Elijah straightened, his body reacting instinctively to the presence of authority. Years of combat had sharpened his senses, and he had learned long ago to expect hostility from those in uniform. But this wasn't combat, this wasn't war. It was something worse, a slow, insidious kind of hatred, the kind that wore a badge. "Hey!" one of the officers barked, his voice thick with contempt. "Didn't you hear me? Move it!" The other officer, standing slightly behind him, grinned as he watched his partner's words land on Elijah's slumped form. He took a step forward, clearly enjoying the power dynamic that had been established between them. Elijah remained seated, unmoving. He had been through far worse than this. His silence was a shield. "Is there a problem, officer?" Elijah's voice was calm, almost too calm, but it held an edge of authority, a lingering hint of something that only those who had seen war would recognize. The first officer, a broad-shouldered man with a sneer etched into his features, stepped closer, his boots tapping on the pavement with each step. He leaned down to meet Elijah's gaze, his voice low and threatening. "You got a problem with authority, old man?" He spat. Elijah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply watched. The officer, his posture rigid, but his hands remained steady on his knees. The second officer, a younger man with a thin mustache, eyed Elijah with suspicion, clearly uncomfortable with the interaction. But his partner was determined to press the issue. "Get up," the officer demanded, grabbing Elijah's shoulder and yanking him from his seat. The roughness of the movement was jarring, but Elijah's body barely flinched. His muscles were tense, calculating the threat. He had been trained to handle far worse than a couple of cops. He was no longer the man he had been in uniform, but the skills and instincts were still there. "I don't want any trouble," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. He knew this was about to escalate. It always did. He could feel the tension building in the officer's stance, the almost palpable desire to humiliate him, to break him down. But Elijah wasn't going to give him the satisfaction, but the officer wasn't having it. He shoved Elijah again, harder this time. "You're coming with us," the officer growled, his hand tightening on Elijah's arm. The second officer moved in, eager to back up his partner. But as they attempted to drag him away, something in Elijah snapped. He had endured enough. His body moved before he could think, a reflex honed over years of combat training. With a quick, sharp motion, Elijah twisted his body and freed himself. From the officer's grip, sending the man stumbling back. Before either officer could react, Elijah's right fist connected with the first officer's jaw. The force was enough to send the man crashing into the trash cans beside them, his weapon clattering to the ground. The second officer stepped back, his eyes wide with surprise. "What the hell, man?" he yelled, his hand instinctively going to his gun. But Elijah was already one step ahead. Without a moment's hesitation, Elijah moved swiftly, grabbing the officer's wrist and twisting it, forcing the gun out of his hand before the officer could even fire. The young officer was caught off guard, his body easily controlled by Elijah's expertise. With a final push, the officer was sent sprawling to the ground. "Get out of here," Elijah growled, his voice carrying the weight of authority that the officers couldn't deny. For a brief moment, the second officer hesitated, looking at his partner sprawled on the ground. Then, with a grunt of frustration, he turned and ran, disappearing into the crowd. Elijah stood still, watching them retreat. The sounds of the city seemed distant now, muffled as he caught his breath. His body was already preparing for the next confrontation, his mind racing through escape plans. But there was one thing Elijah couldn't escape: the realization that Graves's system wasn't something he could punch his way out of. It was bigger, and it was more insidious than anything he had faced before. He stood tall, his breathing steady now, his gaze turning toward the horizon. For a brief moment, the streets were calm again. But Elijah knew better. The storm was just beginning. As the first officer groaned and staggered to his feet, his eyes filled with fury, Elijah turned and began to walk away. He had no use for this fight. He had bigger things to deal with, but that small act of defiance had been enough to spark something in him. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about making them see the truth, making them feel the weight of the lives they had crushed. As Elijah walks away, he knows the fight has only just begun. The officers, the system, and everything he once fought for, they're all connected, and Elijah will have to confront them all. His past and the skills he once thought buried are about to come back to life. The question remains, how far is Elijah willing to go to expose the truth, and what will be the cost of doing so? Full Chapter 2. The city was a cacophony of noise and movement. The honking of car horns, the distant chatter of pedestrians, the steady hum of power lines above. But Elijah felt none of it. His senses were dulled, his focus narrowing as he walked the streets like a ghost, blending into the background unnoticed by the world that passed him by. The events of the afternoon still lingered in his mind, but the adrenaline was fading, replaced by the cold, quiet realization that things were about to escalate. The confrontation with the officers hadn't been part of the plan. Elijah hadn't wanted to attract attention. He hadn't planned on drawing the line in the sand so quickly. But the moment the officer's hand had touched his shoulder, something inside him had snapped. He wasn't just a homeless man anymore. He was something else. Someone with a history of surviving wars that weren't his to fight. He was a weapon, trained to handle the worst situations imaginable, and it was clear that the world around him was about to see that. He walked past a row of apartment buildings, their windows dark against the setting sun. The smell of grease and garbage filled the air, but Elijah barely noticed. His mind was somewhere else, back in the heat of battle, where every move mattered, every decision counted. Back in the desert, in foreign lands, where survival was a constant game of cat and mouse. His body had been trained to fight in the most unforgiving conditions, and now, in the midst of this city, he felt more alive than he had in years. But the city was different from the battlefield. Here, his enemies weren't soldiers. They weren't men who wore uniforms or spoke a language he could understand. His enemies here were systems, institutions that had grown far too powerful, far too entrenched to be taken down by force alone. Elijah's stomach twisted as he passed a homeless man sitting on the corner, his face drawn and weary. The man glanced up at him, but Elijah just kept walking. He wasn't the same man anymore. The city had made him someone else. And yet the city hadn't changed. It was still the same place he had always known, where those who had nothing were overlooked, ignored, or worse, trampled. The sounds of the city faded away as his mind drifted back to the past, to the years he had spent with Delta Force. The training had been grueling, brutal, but it had taught him everything he needed to know about survival. It had taught him how to move in the shadows, how to blend in and disappear when needed. But now, in the heart of the city, he didn't know how to disappear. The system had its claws in everything: the police, the government, the media, all working in tandem to keep the powerful in control. That was why Elijah had left the military. He had seen it firsthand: the corruption, the betrayal. The system that claimed to fight for justice was the very system that kept people like him down, and when he had tried to stand up, to speak out, they had silenced him, pushed him aside like a pawn in their game. The war he had fought in wasn't just in foreign lands. It was here, at home, in a country that claimed to be free, but was ruled by the very forces that had oppressed him. Elijah reached the edge of the park and stopped by a bench, sitting down and looking out over the quiet expanse of grass. A few children were playing in the distance, their laughter filling the air. But it didn't feel real. Everything felt detached, like he was watching the world from behind a glass. He couldn't shake the feeling that the world was slipping through his fingers, and that he was powerless to stop it. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The officers from earlier had been just a glimpse of the larger problem. Graves, the system, the people who had used and discarded him like a tool, they were the real enemy now. Elijah had learned to fight on the battlefield, but this wasn't war. This was something else entirely, and as much as he hated it, he knew he couldn't fight it alone. "Hey, you!" a voice suddenly called out, snapping Elijah from his thoughts. He looked up to see a man in a suit walking toward him, his face twisted with disgust. The man stopped in front of Elijah, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "What are you doing here?" the man asked, his tone dripping with disdain. Elijah stood slowly, his muscles tight with the instinct to move. "Just resting," the man scoffed. "You people don't belong here. Go back to where you came from." Elijah's jaw tightened. The words stung, but he refused to let them show. He had heard worse, seen worse. But this was the real enemy. It wasn't the officers or Graves or anyone who wore a badge. It was people like this man, who thought they had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. "I don't answer to you," Elijah said flatly, his voice calm but carrying the weight of something much darker. "And I'm not going anywhere," the man sneered, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "You should know your place, homeless." Elijah's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't move. He had fought men with far more power than this one. He had faced death in ways this man couldn't even imagine. But here, in the city, it wasn't about fighting with fists. It was about something much harder. It was about surviving in a world that didn't care if you lived or died. And Elijah wasn't ready to give up. The man turned, walking away with a final sneer over his shoulder. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Elijah stood there for a moment, watching the man disappear into the crowd. His mind was a whirlwind, the anger and frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He had seen enough of this, enough of people being treated like they didn't matter. Enough of the system that punished those who couldn't fight back. He had come to the city to find peace, to escape the demons of his past. But now, it seemed like the demons were everywhere. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, for the people like him who had been left behind, ignored by the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in darkness, Elijah knew that this fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. And this time, he wasn't going to back down. Elijah's past as a Delta Force commander is catching up with him, but the fight he faces now is one of survival against a system designed to break him. The city may have turned its back on him, but he's not done yet. The real battle is just beginning. Will Elijah take on the system that has crushed so many before him, or will it destroy him first? Full Chapter 3. The night air felt heavy, suffocating, as Elijah wandered the streets, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The system he had fought against was closer than ever, its influence creeping into every corner of his mind. The homeless man he had seen earlier was a reminder. Society's most vulnerable, discarded and forgotten by the world, all because they weren't part of a system that valued power over people. As Elijah walked, his mind drifted back to the days when he had been more than a broken man wandering the streets. Back then, there had been purpose in every mission, a cause that had made sense. The discipline, the skill, the brotherhood, it had all come with a price, but he had known the cost. It was a fight that had meaning, that had direction. This fight was more chaotic. This fight had no clear lines. He turned down an alley and stopped at a small cafe, the faint smell of coffee hanging in the air. There, sitting at a corner table with a laptop and a stack of papers, was Maya. Elijah had seen her before, but only from a distance. She was part of the activist community, a vocal critic of the system that allowed men like Graves to operate with impunity. She had a reputation, someone who wasn't afraid to push the boundaries, to take on the establishment. Maya looked up as Elijah approached, her eyes narrowing slightly as she sized him up. There was a cautiousness to her demeanor, but also a quiet strength. She wasn't afraid, not of him, not of anyone. "You've been watching me for a while now," Maya said, her voice steady. "I don't know what you want, but I'm not interested in your pity." Elijah hesitated for a moment before pulling out the chair across from her. "I'm not here for pity," he said, his voice low but sure. "I'm here because we have a problem, a big one, and I think we both know it." Maya didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat back in her chair, looking him over, as if weighing the situation. "Go on," she finally said, her expression unreadable. "I've seen the way the system works," Elijah began, leaning forward. "I've seen it from the inside. I used to fight for this country, for a cause, but I left that life behind. Now I'm just a part of the system that it doesn't care about, but I'm not blind to it. There's something wrong, and it's bigger than just Graves. It's everything. The police, the politicians, the media, they're all in on it." Maya nodded slowly, her fingers tapping against the edge of her laptop. "I know. I've been fighting it for years. I've been exposing the truth, gathering evidence, but the system fights back, harder than we realize. The power they have isn't just money. It's control. They control the media, the narrative, the laws. It's like trying to break a wall with your bare hands." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting for a moment. He had seen what she was talking about, but he had always thought of it as just the way things were. But now, seeing it through Maya's eyes, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, not for himself, but for something bigger. "I don't know if I can fight this system alone," Elijah said, his voice laced with a quiet realization. "But I think if we work together, we have a shot. We expose Graves, sure, but we have to expose everything. The people who are running this show. It's not just one man, it's a web, and we need to cut it." Maya's expression softened, but there was a fire in her eyes now. "You're right, but doing that won't just take down Graves. It'll take down everything. The police, the mayor, the corporations, they'll come after us. Hard. And we can't fight that kind of battle with just information. Then we fight smarter," Elijah said, his eyes hardening with a renewed sense of purpose. "We use their own system against them. If they think they control everything, we show them they don't. We expose them in a way they can't ignore. We take it straight to the people. The truth isn't just a weapon. It's a movement. Maya considered his words carefully before nodding. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But we're not talking about just any fight here. We're talking about dismantling the entire system. That's not a battle you win with a few leaks or public protests. I know, Elijah replied. But I've fought in worse battles. I've faced down enemies who would kill me without a second thought. The system's no different. It's just another enemy. We've got the truth on our side. That's the one thing they can't control. Maya leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. All right, Elijah. But if we're going to do this, we need to act fast. The more we expose, the more dangerous it's going to get. And the longer we wait, the more chances Graves and his people have to shut us down. They've already got people inside the media, the government. They'll try to bury this. But we can't let them. Elijah nodded. We start tonight. They spent the next several hours strategizing, going over every detail of the plan. Maya had already gathered substantial evidence against Graves, but it was more than just documentation. It was proof of an entire network of corruption. She had contacts who could help push the story to the right people, but they had to move quickly. Time was running out, and the longer they waited, the more chances Graves had to cover his tracks. Elijah knew the risks. He had been trained for danger. But this was different. They were up against something that didn't care about honor, about right or wrong. They were up against a system that could crush them without even blinking. But that didn't matter now. The wheels were in motion, and Elijah was in for the fight of his life. By the time the night settled in, Elijah and Maya were ready to make their move. The plan was simple. Leak the evidence to the public, make sure it was undeniable, and then let the people take control of the narrative. But Elijah knew it wasn't going to be that easy. Nothing ever was. That was why Elijah had left the military. He had seen it firsthand. The corruption, the betrayal, the system that claimed to fight for justice was the very system that kept people like him down. And when he had tried to stand up, to speak out, they had silenced him, pushed him aside like a pawn in their game. The war he had fought in wasn't just in foreign lands. It was here, at home, in a country that claimed to be free, but was ruled by the very forces that had oppressed him. Elijah reached the edge of the park and stopped by a bench, sitting down and looking out over the quiet expanse of grass. A few children were playing in the distance, their laughter filling the air. But it didn't feel real. Everything felt detached, like he was watching the world from behind a glass. He couldn't shake the feeling that the world was slipping through his fingers, and that he was powerless to stop it. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The officers from earlier had been just a glimpse of the larger problem. Graves, the system, the people who had used and discarded him like a tool, they were the real enemy now. Elijah had learned to fight on the battlefield, but this wasn't war. This was something else entirely, and as much as he hated it, he knew he couldn't fight it alone. "Hey, you!" a voice suddenly called out, snapping Elijah from his thoughts. He looked up to see a man in a suit walking toward him, his face twisted with disgust. The man stopped in front of Elijah, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "What are you doing here?" the man asked, his tone dripping with disdain. Elijah stood slowly, his muscles tight with the instinct to move. "Just resting," the man scoffed. "You people don't belong here. Go back to where you came from." Elijah's jaw tightened. The words stung, but he refused to let them show. He had heard worse, seen worse. But this was the real enemy. It wasn't the officers or Graves or anyone who wore a badge. It was people like this man, who thought they had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. "I don't answer to you," Elijah said flatly, his voice calm but carrying the weight of something much darker. "And I'm not going anywhere," the man sneered, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "You should know your place, homeless." Elijah's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't move. He had fought men with far more power than this one. He had faced death in ways this man couldn't even imagine. But here, in the city, it wasn't about fighting with fists. It was about something much harder. It was about surviving in a world that didn't care if you lived or died. And Elijah wasn't ready to give up. The man turned, walking away with a final sneer over his shoulder. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Elijah stood there for a moment, watching the man disappear into the crowd. His mind was a whirlwind, the anger and frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He had seen enough of this, enough of people being treated like they didn't matter, enough of the system that punished those who couldn't fight back. He had come to the city to find peace, to escape the demons of his past. But now, it seemed like the demons were everywhere. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for something bigger, for the people like him who had been left behind, ignored by the world. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in darkness, Elijah knew that this fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. And this time, he wasn't going to back down. Elijah's past as a Delta Force commander is catching up with him. But the fight he faces now is one of survival against a system designed to break him. The city may have turned its back on him, but he's not done yet. The real battle is just beginning. Will Elijah take on the system that has crushed so many before him, or will it destroy him first? Full Chapter 3. The night air felt heavy, suffocating, as Elijah wandered the streets, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The system he had fought against was closer than ever, its influence creeping into every corner of his mind. The homeless man he had seen earlier was a reminder. Society's most vulnerable, discarded and forgotten by the world, all because they weren't part of a system that valued power over people. As Elijah walked, his mind drifted back to the days when he had been more than a broken man wandering the streets. Back then, there had been purpose in every mission, a cause that had made sense. The discipline, the skill, the brotherhood, it had all come with a price, but he had known the cost. It was a fight that had meaning, that had direction. This fight was more chaotic. This fight had no clear lines. He turned down an alley and stopped at a small cafe, the faint smell of coffee hanging in the air. There, sitting at a corner table with a laptop and a stack of papers, was Maya. Elijah had seen her before, but only from a distance. She was part of the activist community, a vocal critic of the system that allowed men like Graves to operate with impunity. She had a reputation, someone who wasn't afraid to push the boundaries, to take on the establishment. Maya looked up as Elijah approached, her eyes narrowing slightly as she sized him up. There was a cautiousness to her demeanor, but also a quiet strength. She wasn't afraid, not of him, not of anyone. "You've been watching me for a while now," Maya said, her voice steady. "I don't know what you want, but I'm not interested in your pity." Elijah hesitated for a moment before pulling out the chair across from her. "I'm not here for pity," he said, his voice low but sure. "I'm here because we have a problem, a big one, and I think we both know it." Maya didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat back in her chair, looking him over, as if weighing the situation. "Go on," she finally said, her expression unreadable. "I've seen the way the system works," Elijah began, leaning forward. "I've seen it from the inside. I used to fight for this country, for a cause, but I left that life behind. Now I'm just a part of the system that it doesn't care about, but I'm not blind to it. There's something wrong, and it's bigger than just Graves. It's everything. The police, the politicians, the media, they're all in on it." Maya nodded slowly, her fingers tapping against the edge of her laptop. "I know. I've been fighting it for years. I've been exposing the truth, gathering evidence, but the system fights back, harder than we realize. The power they have isn't just money. It's control. They control the media, the narrative, the laws. It's like trying to break a wall with your bare hands. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting for a moment. He had seen what she was talking about, but he had always thought of it as just the way things were. But now, seeing it through Maya's eyes, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, not for himself, but for something bigger. "I don't know if I can fight this system alone," Elijah said, his voice laced with a quiet realization. "But I think if we work together, we have a shot. We expose Graves, sure, but we have to expose everything. The people who are running this show. It's not just one man, it's a web, and we need to cut it." Maya's expression softened, but there was a fire in her eyes now. "You're right, but doing that won't just take down Graves. It'll take down everything. The police, the mayor, the corporations, they'll come after us. Hard. And we can't fight that kind of battle with just information." "Then we fight smarter," Elijah said, his eyes hardening with a renewed sense of purpose. "We use their own system against them. If they think they control everything, we show them they don't. We expose them in a way they can't ignore. We take it straight to the people. The truth isn't just a weapon. It's a movement." Maya considered his words carefully before nodding. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But we're not talking about just any fight here. We're talking about dismantling the entire system. That's not a battle you win with a few leaks or public protests." "I know," Elijah replied. "But I've fought in worse battles. I've faced down enemies who would kill me without a second thought. The system's no different. It's just another enemy. We've got the truth on our side. That's the one thing they can't control." Maya leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "All right, Elijah. But if we're going to do this, we need to act fast. The more we expose, the more dangerous it's going to get. And the longer we wait, the more chances Graves and his people have to shut us down. They've already got people inside the media, the government. They'll try to bury this. But we can't let them." Elijah nodded. "We start tonight." They spent the next several hours strategizing, going over every detail of the plan. Maya had already gathered substantial evidence against Graves, but it was more than just documentation. It was proof of an entire network of corruption. She had contacts who could help push the story to the right people, but they had to move quickly. Time was running out, and the longer they waited, the more chances Graves had to cover his tracks. Elijah knew the risks. He had been trained for danger. But this was different. They were up against something that didn't care about honor, about right or wrong. They were up against a system that could crush them without even blinking. But that didn't matter now. The wheels were in motion, and Elijah was in for the fight of his life. By the time the night settled in, Elijah and Maya were ready to make their move. The plan was simple: leak the evidence to the public, make sure it was undeniable, and then let the people take control of the narrative. But Elijah knew it wasn't going to be that easy. Nothing ever was. As they prepared to send the final documents, Elijah couldn't help but feel the weight of what they were about to do. This wasn't just about exposing Graves. This was about taking on everything. The system that had allowed men like Graves to operate with impunity, the institutions that kept people like Elijah down, they were all going to be exposed, and Elijah wasn't afraid anymore. The fight to expose Graves and the system is just beginning, but the risk has never been higher. As Elijah and Maya take the final step toward revealing the truth, they find themselves facing an enemy that will stop at nothing to protect its power. The battle for justice is about to explode, and Elijah must decide how far he's willing to go to win. Full Chapter 4. Elijah and Maya had no time to waste. The moment they had sent the evidence out to the press, they knew the storm was coming. The first few hours were a blur of messages and frantic calls, but the slow realization was dawning on them. Exposing Graves wasn't the hard part. Surviving the fallout was. Sitting in the safe house, Their phones buzzed incessantly with notifications. Maya had already contacted several journalists and activists who were known for exposing corruption, hoping that they could help amplify the story. But as the hours ticked by, Elijah could feel the noose tightening around them. "The story's spreading," Maya said, staring at her laptop. "But so are the lies. The mayor's office issued a statement saying that the documents we released are fabricated. The press is eating it up." Elijah leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. The weight of what they had just done was starting to sink in. They had exposed Graves's ties to the mayor, the police, and several high-profile businesses. But now that the world knew, it was only a matter of time before Graves's people tried to bury it. "They've got the media on their side," Elijah said, his voice hoarse. "They'll spin this. They'll try to make us look like criminals. We knew this was coming." Maya was silent for a moment, typing furiously on her laptop. "They're already doing it. They've got their own people on the inside. But we've got the truth on our side, and that's something they can't control." Jason's heart sank. "You don't know these people like I do. Graves has power everywhere. His reach goes beyond the media and the police. He's got men in places we haven't even thought of." Maya turned to him, her eyes intense. "That's why we can't stop now. The people need to see what's really happening. We can't let Graves win. If we back down, if we let him silence us, it's all over." Elijah sighed deeply. He had never been the type to give up, but the reality of the situation was beginning to wear on him. They were fighting against a system that had been in place for decades. What chance did two people, even with the truth on their side, really have against such an entrenched power structure? "We need to find a way to get this out in front of the public," Maya continued, determination in her voice. "We need to put pressure on the people in power." Elijah nodded slowly. "We need to expose more than just Graves. We need to expose the whole system, the whole damn machine that's been keeping people like us in the dark." The next few days were a whirlwind. Elijah and Maya spent every moment trying to stay ahead of Graves's men, knowing that the longer they remained a target, the more dangerous it would get. Their once quiet, tactical plan was quickly turning into an all-out war. Late one night, as they were meeting with a group of whistleblowers, Elijah received an unexpected message. "They're coming for you. You don't have much time. Get out of the city, now." The message was from Carla, the journalist who had been helping them leak information. She had been their inside contact, feeding them information from her network of sources. Elijah knew that Carla wasn't the type to panic. If she was telling him to leave, it meant they were dangerously close to being caught. "We have to go," Elijah said to Maya, his voice low and tense. "Graves's people are closing in. If we stay, we're dead." Maya's face was pale, but her resolve remained unchanged. "Where will we go?" Elijah looked out the window of their temporary safe house, his mind racing. "I don't know yet, but we need to find somewhere they won't find us. We can't stop now." The tension in the air was palpable as they packed their things and made their way through the back alleys, staying out of sight. Elijah kept his head low, his heart pounding in his chest as they moved quickly. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. They weren't just trying to survive anymore. They were trying to change the world. But as they approached the edge of the city, Elijah felt a pang of doubt. This wasn't just about exposing Graves. It was about something deeper, something that went beyond one man. It was about the system that had allowed people like Graves to thrive for so long, a system that had protected the powerful while crushing the weak. And as much as Elijah wanted to take that system down, he knew it wouldn't be easy. As they reached their destination, Elijah and Maya took shelter in a small abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. It was a risk, but it was the only place they could afford to hide for the time being. "Okay," Maya said, taking a deep breath. "We've got a few hours before we need to move again. What's the plan?" Elijah rubbed his forehead, his mind spinning. They needed to stay ahead of Graves's men, but they also needed to put the pressure on the system. The evidence they had was enough to start a revolution, but they had to make sure it didn't get buried in the chaos. "We hit them where it hurts," Elijah said. "We expose Graves's connections to the mayor, the cops, the businesses. But we also need to hit the media. If we can get enough people on our side, we can force their hand." Maya nodded, her eyes wide with determination. "We can do this, but we need help. We need to get the truth to the people. It's time to bring the fight to them." The next morning, Elijah and Maya began to put their plan into action. They reached out to more journalists, activists, and trusted allies who'd been working behind the scenes to expose Graves's empire. The response was overwhelming. The truth was out, and people were starting to take notice. But as the pressure mounted, Graves's retaliation was swift. His men began targeting anyone involved in the leak, including journalists, activists, and even innocent bystanders. The media, which had initially picked up the story, started to turn on them, with Graves using his influence to silence the press. The backlash was brutal. But Elijah and Maya refused to back down. With the final pieces of the puzzle in place, they prepared to go public with everything they had. The revolution was about to begin, but so was the battle for their lives. The fight for justice is reaching its climax, but Elijah and Maya are about to face their greatest challenge yet. As Graves's men close in on them, the pressure to expose the truth intensifies. Can they make it out alive, or will the system crush them before they can finish what they started? Full Chapter 5. The weight of the night pressed down on Elijah. As he and Maya sat in the dimly lit room, the flickering light from a lone lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The world outside was still, but inside everything was shifting, like the city itself was on the verge of collapsing. The air was thick with tension, every moment ticking by faster than the last. They had been at this for days, relentlessly, pushing forward, leaking documents, contacting journalists, and warning their allies. But despite their efforts, the retaliation from Graves's men had been swift and brutal. "They're everywhere," Maya said, her voice tight with frustration. "I've been monitoring the news, and there's a media blackout. Graves has all the right people on his side, and it's starting to feel like the truth isn't enough anymore." Elijah rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the world settling in on his shoulders. His body ached from the constant stress, the lack of sleep, the fear of what would happen next. They had moved fast, exposing Graves's empire, but as the cracks in the system began to show, the response from those in power was faster and more merciless than he could have imagined. "We've only exposed the tip of the iceberg," Elijah said quietly. "The real battle is against the entire system. Graves isn't just a man. He's the face of something much bigger, something that's been embedded in every corner of this city." Maya nodded grimly. "The system that's been keeping us down for decades. The system that was built to protect men like Graves and crush people like us. It's not just Graves we're fighting. It's the entire machine." Elijah's mind raced as he thought of his time in Delta Force, of the battles he had fought on foreign soil. None of those fights had been as complicated as this one. There had always been a clear enemy, a clear mission. But here, the enemy was invisible, operating through laws and institutions that most people never questioned. It wasn't just Graves and his corrupt dealings that they had to take down. It was everything: the police, the media, the politicians. And to do that, Elijah knew they would need more than just the truth. "We need to change the game," Elijah said, his voice filled with resolve. "We can't keep playing by their rules. If we keep fighting on their terms, we'll lose. We need to turn their own system against them." Maya's eyes flickered with determination. "How?" "We make them see that we're not just a threat to Graves," Elijah said. "We're a threat to everything they stand for. We take the fight to the streets, to the people. If the public sees how deep the corruption goes, they won't let them get away with it." Maya hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering over the papers and documents strewn across the table. "You're right, but exposing everything isn't enough. We need a plan to keep them from silencing us before we finish what we started. Graves is too powerful. He has too many people on his side." Elijah stood up, his mind already working through the plan. He had fought in wars where the enemy had all the power, where victory had seemed impossible, but he had never backed down. This fight was no different. The stakes were higher, the risks greater, but the cause was just, and Elijah wasn't about to stop. "We've got one shot," he said, his voice steady. "We need to give the people the power to take control of the narrative. If we can get them on our side, we'll be unstoppable." Maya nodded, her expression focused. "How do we do that?" Elijah looked out the window, the city lights casting a dim glow across the skyline. The storm was coming, and it was only a matter of time before everything exploded. But he wasn't afraid. He had lived through too much to be afraid now. "We hit them where it hurts," Elijah said. "We expose Graves and his connections, yes, but we also expose the system that keeps people like him in power. We start a movement. We get the people involved, and we make sure the media can't ignore it. We use everything we have. Social media, underground channels, whatever it takes. The more noise we make, the harder it will be for them to suppress us." Maya's eyes lit up with realization. "You're right. If we can make enough noise, if we can get the truth into the hands of the people, they won't be able to shut it down. They'll have to listen." Elijah smiled grimly. "Exactly. We give them no choice." The next few days were a blur of activity. Elijah and Maya worked around the clock, reaching out to journalists, activists, and anyone who could help amplify their message. They used every tool at their disposal, from encrypted messages to underground channels, to get the truth into the public's hands. The media, for the most part, remained silent, too afraid or too complicit to take a stand. But the people were starting to listen. Social media exploded with posts and hashtags, and soon the story of Graves' corruption was spreading like wildfire. Videos of Elijah's confrontation with the cops went viral, and the images of a homeless man who had once been a Delta Force commander became a symbol of resistance. People were outraged, demanding action, but as the public pressure grew, so did the backlash. Graves's men were everywhere, hunting down those who had helped Elijah and Maya. The city felt more dangerous with each passing day, and Elijah could sense the noose tightening around them. "They're coming," Maya said, her voice low and urgent as she watched the latest news broadcast. "Graves's people are already targeting the journalists and activists. The police are getting involved. We've made them scared." Elijah clenched his fists. Good, they should be scared. But as the days wore on, the pressure mounted. Graves was not going to go down without a fight. The power he held over the city was too great, and he had far too many connections to let two people bring him down. Graves would stop at nothing to protect his empire. And the more Elijah and Maya exposed, the more dangerous it became. That night, as they prepared to leak more evidence, the door to the safe house creaked open, and Elijah tensed. He turned to Maya, his heart racing. "We've been compromised," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to move. Now." As Elijah and Maya make their final push to expose Graves, they find themselves surrounded by enemies on all sides. With the system fighting back harder than ever, they must decide whether to risk everything to finish what they started or retreat to save their lives. The revolution is on the brink of exploding, and Elijah is about to face the ultimate test of his resolve. Full Chapter 6. The safe house had become a prison, and the walls felt like they were closing in. Elijah and Maya had been holed up for days, unable to move freely through the city. Graves's men were everywhere, sweeping through the streets, hunting down anyone who had been involved in exposing him. But the fight wasn't over yet. Elijah could feel the weight of the final push coming. The world knew the truth now, and nothing could stop it. But there were moments, small flickers of doubt, that gnawed at him. The city was a pressure cooker, the tension building with every passing second. The truth was out there, yes, but with the system so deeply entrenched, could they really bring it down? Could they really survive this? The phone on the table buzzed, snapping Elijah from his thoughts. Maya, who had been pacing the room, stopped and grabbed it, her eyes scanning the screen before her face went pale. "What is it?" Elijah asked, his pulse quickening. Maya stood frozen for a moment, her face unreadable. Then, with a soft exhale, she looked up at him. "It's from Carla. She's been arrested." Elijah's heart sank. Carla had been their ally, their inside source. She had been the one feeding them information, the one helping them leak the documents. If Carla had been caught, everything they had worked for was in jeopardy. "No," Elijah muttered, stepping forward. "No, that's not possible. She wouldn't turn on us." Maya handed him the phone. Elijah read the message quickly. "They've got me. They know everything. They'll come for you next. I didn't betray you. Please, just get out. They're watching." It was short, desperate, but there was something else in the message. Something Elijah couldn't put his finger on. His stomach twisted as he handed the phone back to Maya. "This is a setup," Elijah said, his voice low with realization. "Graves's people must have gotten to her." Maya's face hardened, but there was no anger, just a deep, overwhelming sense of dread. "But she said she didn't betray us. She's telling the truth, Elijah. She wouldn't lie." Elijah paced the room, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. If they had underestimated the threat, they were already too deep into this fight to back out now. "We have to move fast. If they know where she is, they might have already caught everyone else we've contacted." Maya nodded. "We need to find out what happened, get to the bottom of it before it's too late." They wasted no time. Elijah and Maya packed their things quickly, heading out into the night, their only goal to get to Carla before Graves's men could do worse. The city streets were eerily quiet at this hour, the only sound their footsteps echoing against the pavement, but it wasn't long before Elijah could feel the familiar pressure in his chest. The danger was closing in. As they approached the building where Carla had been staying, Elijah's instincts kicked in. He had been trained to read situations, to know when danger was near. This felt wrong. The street was empty, too empty. His eyes flicked around. The darkened alleyways, every shadow a potential threat. "Stay close," Elijah whispered to Maya, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his side. They moved quickly, ducking into an alley that ran along the side of the building. Elijah's eyes scanned the street for any signs of movement. They reached the entrance, but as they did, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Carla. Elijah froze, disbelief washing over him. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning her face. She looked different. Her usual calm demeanor was replaced with something else. Fear. But there was something else, something that didn't sit right with him. "Carla," Elijah asked, his voice cautious, "what's going on? We thought—" "Don't," Carla interrupted, her voice sharp. "You don't understand. They're watching me. They know everything. I didn't betray you, Elijah, but if you stay, they'll get you too." Maya stepped forward, her expression confused. "Then why come here? Why meet us?" Carla hesitated, her eyes darting between them. "I'm trying to fix this, but I need your help. I've got a way out, but you need to trust me." Elijah narrowed, his eyes, his instincts screaming that something was off. Carla had always been the calm, calculated one. She wasn't the type to panic or make rash decisions. And yet here she was, seemingly desperate. You need to tell us what's going on, Elijah said firmly. Why are you acting like this? What happened? Carla's eyes flicked to the side, as if she was checking to make sure no one was watching. They got to me before you did. They knew everything you were planning. Graves's people. They made me give them information. I didn't have a choice. Elijah's blood ran cold. His worst fears had come true. Carla had been compromised. How much did you tell them? He asked, his voice tight. Carla shook her head quickly. I didn't tell them everything, I swear. But they've got eyes everywhere. They're watching, all of us now. The leaks have already started, and they're getting ready to shut it all down. They know we've been working against them. Maya took a step back, her face filled with disbelief. You were working with them the whole time? No, Carla said, almost pleading. I wasn't, I swear, but I'm not safe. They've threatened me, threatened my family. You don't understand. They have people everywhere. I'm not strong enough to fight this alone. Elijah stood still, processing the words, the shock settling in. Everything they had worked for, everything they had fought for, was starting to fall apart. But then something clicked. You said they have eyes everywhere, so why come here? Why risk everything to meet us? Carla's face contorted with guilt. Because I want to make it right. I need your help, Elijah. We're running out of time, but I can't do this alone anymore. Elijah took a step back, his mind running through the possibilities. There was a part of him that wanted to trust Carla. She had helped them after all. But the situation had changed, and the stakes were higher than ever. There was no room for mistakes now. He looked at Maya, who stood silently by his side, her face unreadable. What do you think? He asked her quietly. Maya glanced at Carla and then back at Elijah. I don't know, but we don't have much time. If she's telling the truth, we need to act fast. Elijah's mind raced. Every moment they hesitated was another step closer to being caught. He had fought too hard to let Graves win, to let this corrupt system continue. And if Carla was right, they still had a shot, but trust had become a luxury he couldn't afford. I'll help you, Elijah said finally, his voice steady. But understand this. If you're playing us, we won't hesitate to walk away. Carla nodded quickly, relief washing over her face. I understand. Let's move. Elijah and Maya are on the verge of uncovering the truth, but betrayal and uncertainty cloud their every step. With the stakes higher than ever, can they trust Carla, or has the system already corrupted her? The battle for justice is far from over, and the true enemy is closer than they realize. Full, Chapter 7. The air was thick with tension as Elijah and Maya sat in their temporary hideout, a small apartment on the edge of town. Carla had left them in the early hours of the morning, disappearing into the shadows with promises to bring back more information. But Elijah wasn't sure if he could trust her anymore. The betrayal stung deeper than he had expected. He had always known there was a risk, but the idea that someone who had helped them might have been compromised felt like a blow to his core. What if she's playing us? Maya's voice broke through Elijah's thoughts. What if we're just being used as pawns in a game we don't understand? Elijah didn't answer right away. His mind was too clouded with doubt, anger, and exhaustion. He had been fighting this battle for what felt like forever, and every step forward seemed to lead them deeper into a web of lies and deception. The truth was out there, but the system that had protected men like Graves was far stronger than any of them had anticipated. We don't have a choice, Elijah said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. We have to keep pushing. If we stop now, it's over. Maya leaned back in her chair, her eyes focused on the wall. She didn't say anything, but Elijah could see the weariness in her eyes. They were both running on fumes, physically and emotionally drained. by the constant pressure. Every time they thought they were one step ahead, Graves seemed to have a dozen men ready to tear their progress apart. "Do you think the people are ready for this?" Maya asked, her voice quieter now. Elijah glanced at her. "They have to be." The truth they had been fighting to expose, the corruption, the bribery, the connections between Graves and the mayor, the police, and the powerful corporations that fueled the system, was finally reaching the surface. But the system was fighting back harder than ever. The media, which had initially run with their story, was starting to pull away, issuing retractions and downplaying the evidence. And now it seemed that Graves's men were everywhere, tracking their every move. The phone rang, cutting through the heavy silence in the room. Elijah's heart skipped a beat as he reached for it, his eyes darting to Maya. She didn't speak, but her tension was palpable. "Carla," Elijah said when he saw the name on the screen. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "What is it?" "Listen to me," Carla's voice crackled through the phone, sharp and urgent. "Graves knows everything. I've been compromised. They've been following me, watching my every move. I never meant to betray you, but now I can't get out." Elijah's blood ran cold, his grip tightening on the phone. "What do you mean you can't get out?" "I've led them straight to you. I didn't know they had eyes everywhere. I thought I could protect you, but I failed." Carla's voice trembled with guilt. "They're coming for you, Elijah. It's too late." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Carla's betrayal, her fear, the fact that she had led them into a trap. It was all too much. For a brief moment, Elijah felt himself falter. He had trusted her, believed that she was one of the few who understood the fight, who cared about the truth. But now everything was coming undone. "Where are you?" Elijah's voice was low, urgent. "I'm hiding, but I won't be safe for long. They'll track me down. They'll track you down too," Carla said, her words becoming more frantic. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but you have to get out of there. They know about the safe house. They'll be there soon." Elijah's heart hammered in his chest. He glanced at Maya, who was already on her feet gathering her things. "We don't have much time," Maya said, her eyes scanning the room. "If they're on their way, we need to go. Now." Elijah nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. "Settle in. The safe house wasn't safe anymore. They couldn't stay here. But where could they go? The system that had protected Graves was everywhere. There was no place that could guarantee their safety." As they rushed out the door, the adrenaline coursing through Elijah's veins, his mind was already calculating their next move. He had been trained to think under pressure, to make split-second decisions in life-or-death situations. But this wasn't combat. This wasn't a war fought with guns and strategy. This was a war for justice, for truth, and the enemy they faced was a system that didn't play by the same rules. "We need to go public," Elijah said, his voice hardening with determination. "If we're going to take down Graves, we need to force them into a corner." Maya didn't hesitate. "You're right, but we need to do it in a way that makes it impossible for them to cover it up. We've exposed enough already. Now we push harder." The streets outside were eerily quiet as they slipped through the back alleys, moving quickly and quietly to avoid detection. Elijah's senses were on high alert. Every shadow, every figure moving in the distance, felt like a potential threat. They were being hunted now, and it was only a matter of time before they would have to make their stand. They reached the safe house, a rundown apartment in an area of the city that had been abandoned for years. It was hidden in plain sight, a place where no one would think to look. But as they entered, Elijah felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something bigger, about ensuring that Graves didn't walk away unscathed, that the truth wouldn't be buried. They huddled together, going over their plan again. They would release everything they had, all the evidence, the connections, the names, and they would make sure it reached the people. No more leaks, no more hesitation. But as the hours ticked by, Elijah's resolve began to waver. The more he thought about it, the more he realized the truth. They were up against an enemy that could not be defeated with just truth. They were up against a system that had been built to protect the powerful, to keep the people in line. And as much as Elijah wanted to believe they could win, a part of him knew that the cost of justice would be higher than he had ever imagined. "Are you ready?" Maya's voice broke through his thoughts, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. Elijah nodded, his jaw tightening. "We have to be." As they prepared to make the final move, Elijah's mind flashed back to the war. He had fought to survive, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But this was different. This wasn't about survival. It was about standing up for what was right, and no matter the cost, he wasn't going to back down now. Elijah and Maya are on the verge of making their final push to expose Graves, but the stakes have never been higher. As the system fights back harder than ever, Elijah faces a choice: keep pushing forward and risk losing everything, or retreat. To fight another day. The battle for justice is reaching its tipping point, and Elijah must decide how far he's willing to go. Full Chapter 8. The tension in the air was palpable. Elijah sat at the table, staring at the screen, watching as the last of the evidence, the final pieces of the puzzle, went live. The story was out now. The truth about Graves's corruption and the system that had supported him laid bare for the world to see. The leaks, the documents, the videos, it was all there for anyone to see. And yet, as Elijah sat there, the feeling of victory was fleeting. The fight wasn't over. Graves's empire, his web of connections, was far more powerful than they had anticipated. Elijah knew that exposing the truth was only the beginning. The system that had protected men like Graves for so long was fighting back, and it was fighting harder than they had ever imagined. Maya walked into the room, her face set with determination but tinged with concern. "It's done," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos brewing outside. "The story's out, but they're already starting to cover it up. The media's spinning it, and Graves's people are circling." Elijah didn't answer immediately. He leaned forward, his hands pressed against his temples as he tried to collect his thoughts. He had spent years fighting wars that were black and white. There had been clear enemies, clear objectives. But now, as he looked at the documents on the screen, he realized the real battle wasn't over information or truth. It was about survival. It was about making sure that the system, the very machine that had kept people like Graves in power, didn't crush them before they could finish what they started. "You don't think they can suppress this, do you?" Maya asked, her eyes scanning the room for answers. "They have to know this is bigger than them." Elijah didn't meet her eyes at first. His mind was still spinning, processing the enormity of what they had just done. Exposing Graves had been their mission. But now that the truth was out, it felt like the battle had only just begun. "They're already trying to bury it," Elijah said, his voice grim. "Graves's people have the media in their pockets, the politicians in their back pocket, but we can't stop now. If we pull back now, they win, and I don't plan on losing." Maya nodded, though her eyes flickered with doubt. "I know. But it's not just about us anymore. It's about everyone who's been part of this, everyone Graves has hurt. If we go too far, we'll be playing right into his hands." Elijah stood, pacing back and forth as his mind worked through the possibilities. He couldn't afford to think about the risks. Not now. Every minute they spent second-guessing their next move was another minute Graves had to cover his tracks. "We don't have a choice," Elijah said, stopping in front of Maya. "We finish this now. If we don't, it'll all be for nothing." Maya's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the room was silent. She knew he was right. There was no backing down. Not now. Not after everything they had exposed. The truth was out there, and the people were starting to take notice. But Graves wouldn't go down without a fight. Elijah knew that better than anyone, but this time the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. The next hours were a blur of action. They reached out to the few trusted allies they had left, trying to get the word out as quickly as possible. Elijah and Maya knew they couldn't rely on traditional channels. They had to bypass the media, bypass the system that had already been corrupted by Graves. It was time to take matters into their own hands. Maya worked tirelessly, sending encrypted messages and organizing underground leaks. Elijah knew the fight wasn't just about exposure anymore. It was about putting pressure on the system, creating enough chaos to force Graves and his men to react. And when they did, that would be their opening. The plan was set in motion, and the pieces began to fall into place. The truth was spreading like wildfire, at least among the people who had access to it. But it wasn't enough. Elijah knew they needed more. The truth had to be undeniable, irrefutable. The more people who knew, the more chance they had of breaking through the wall that Graves had built. As the hours dragged on, Elijah could feel the weight of what they were doing, settling on his shoulders. Every decision had a consequence. Every move they made could be their last. The system they were fighting wasn't just corrupt. It was entrenched, pervasive, and far more powerful than they could have imagined. And as the pressure mounted, Elijah realized that even if they succeeded, there would be no going back. They couldn't just expose Graves. They had to expose everything. A few hours before dawn, they gathered their things and prepared to move again. Graves's men were closing in, and they knew the window of opportunity was shrinking fast. As they slipped out into the night, Elijah could hear the distant sound of sirens in the distance. The city was alive with chaos now, but it wasn't the kind of chaos they had planned for. This was the system fighting back. "We've got to move fast," Maya said, her voice strained with urgency. "We're getting close. I can feel it." Elijah nodded. His heart was pounding in his chest. They had come too far to stop now. The truth was out there, and the fight was reaching its climax. But the real battle was just beginning. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting for their lives. They reached their final destination, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where their remaining allies were waiting for them. The plan had changed. They couldn't just release the final evidence. They had to go further. They had to make it impossible for Graves to bury the truth. "Do you think they'll follow us here?" Maya asked, her voice tinged with concern. Elijah looked out over the warehouse parking lot, the shadows long and heavy in the early morning light. "They'll try, but we're ready for them. This time, we don't just expose Graves, we expose the whole system." Maya nodded, her expression hardening with resolve. "We do this together, no turning back." Elijah took a deep breath, his body tense with anticipation. This was it, the final push. There would be no more second chances. This was the moment where everything changed. He had been through wars. He had survived battles that should have killed him. But this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for justice, and for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt the fire of purpose burning inside him. The final move has been made, and the world is watching. But as Elijah and Maya prepare for the ultimate confrontation, the true cost of their fight becomes clearer. The system is fighting back harder than ever, and the consequences of their actions are about to come crashing down. Will they survive the storm, or will the system crush them before they can finish what they started? Full Chapter 9. The first signs of the city's unraveling were small, barely noticeable. A sudden rush of traffic on normally quiet streets, strange silhouettes lurking in alleyways, hushed conversations overheard in coffee shops. But then, like a flood, the chaos began to spread. The stories were out. the evidence of Graves's corruption, his links to the mayor, the police, the corporations. All of it was now in the hands of the people. The leaks, the videos, the documents. It was all there. But the system wasn't just going to let it go. Graves's empire was built on silence, on power, on manipulation. And as the truth spread, the backlash came swiftly. The police began arresting activists, journalists, and anyone they suspected of being involved. The streets were flooded with officers in riot gear. The city, already on edge, was now on the brink of war. Elijah stood by the window of their safe house, watching the chaos unfold outside. His chest tightened as he saw the first flashes of police lights in the distance. Graves's men were out there too. Elijah could feel them closing in, their presence suffocating. The fight had become a war. The lines between right and wrong, truth and lies, were now blurred beyond recognition. Maya sat across from him, her face pale but determined. She had been working tirelessly, coordinating with allies, making sure the evidence reached the right people. But even she could see the danger now. The city was spiraling into chaos, and Elijah knew that the system would do everything in its power to crush them. "We don't have much time," Maya said, her voice tight with urgency. "They're coming for us." Elijah nodded. "We knew this would happen. Graves is powerful, but he's scared. And that's when people like him are the most dangerous." Maya stood up, moving towards the desk. "We need to finish this. We can't let Graves silence us. We can't let him win." Elijah's gaze flickered to the laptop on the desk, where they had just sent the last piece of evidence to the underground network of activists and journalists who had been helping them. The information was out. It was spreading like wildfire. But even now, Elijah knew it wouldn't be enough. Graves's men were too entrenched. The system was too strong. "We've done everything we can," Elijah said, his voice heavy with realization. "But now we're up against something much bigger than just Graves. We're up against the system itself." Maya didn't respond at first. Her eyes focused on the screen. She had been working on getting the final video out to the public, the one that would expose the full extent of the corruption. But the deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. The more people they exposed, the harder it became to trust anyone. It was just after midnight when they heard the knock on the door. Elijah froze, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his side. Maya looked at him, her eyes wide with panic. "Don't enter it," she whispered. "They've found us." But Elijah didn't hesitate. He had been in worse situations. He had faced worse odds. And this wasn't the first time he had been hunted. He walked to the door, slowly, cautiously, his ears straining for any sound from the other side. The tension in the room was suffocating. With a quick movement, Elijah opened the door, only to find Carla standing there, looking frantic and out of breath. "Carla," Elijah said, his voice a mix of surprise and confusion. "What are you doing here?" "I'm sorry," Carla said, her eyes wide with fear. "I had no choice. They were coming for me. I didn't think they would, but they have people everywhere. They know everything." Maya stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, they know everything?" "I thought you were on our side." Carla's eyes flickered to the ground, her hands trembling. "I am, but they forced me to help them. They found out who I was working with, and they used me to track you. I'm sorry, I didn't want to betray you, but—" Elijah's heart sank. He had known something was wrong. He had trusted Carla, believed in her. But now the truth hit him hard. He had been played. "You led them here," Elijah said quietly, his voice low with anger. "You led them to us." Carla's face crumpled with guilt. "I didn't have a choice, Elijah. They threatened my family. They said they'd kill them if I didn't. I never wanted this. I thought I could get out. But I was wrong." Maya stepped forward, her face hardening. "And now you expect us to believe you." Elijah looked at Carla, his emotions a swirl of anger, betrayal, and something else. Something more painful than either of them could understand. You want to help us now, after everything?" Carla took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly. In front of her, "I don't expect forgiveness, I never will, but I'm here now and I'll help you finish this. If you'll let me." Elijah stared at her for a long moment. His mind was a whirlwind, thoughts racing, weighing the consequences of accepting Carla's help. She had betrayed them. She had put them all at risk. But what choice did they have? "We don't have time to waste," Elijah said, finally breaking the silence. "You can help us, but you're on thin ice. If you've brought us here to take us down, I won't hesitate to make you regret it." Carla nodded quickly, her face filled with fear and remorse. "I understand. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help." The next few hours were a blur of action and decision-making. The pressure was mounting, and Elijah knew the system they were fighting against was reaching its breaking point. Graves's men had already begun to target their allies, cutting off any potential help, but Elijah and Maya couldn't stop. They had come too far. Elijah looked over the final video one last time. The footage was damning, exposing Graves's connections to every level of the corrupt system. It was the final piece, the one that would bring it all down. But he knew that once it was out, there would be no turning back. "We release it now," Elijah said, his voice steely with resolve. "We can't wait any longer. We put the pressure on them. Now." Maya nodded, her hand shaking as she hit the send button. Elijah watched the screen as the video began to upload, his heart racing. This was it. The truth was out there, and there was no way to undo it. With the final piece of evidence released, the battle for the truth is far from over. Elijah and Maya have exposed the system, but now they are up against forces they never imagined. Graves's empire is on the brink of collapse, but what will be the cost? As Elijah faces the ultimate test of his resolve, he must decide how much he is willing to sacrifice to finish what he started. Full Chapter 10. The world felt different as the sun rose, but Elijah could barely feel the warmth of it. The room was silent, except for the occasional crackle of the radio on the table. His mind was elsewhere, filled with thoughts of what had come before, the betrayals, the fights, the countless times he had been forced to make impossible decisions. But now, standing at the precipice, everything came down to this: the truth. It had been hours since the final piece of evidence went public. They had released the damning video, showing the depth of Graves's corruption, his connections to the mayor, the police, the businesses, and even the highest levels of government. The media had gone wild for a moment, but the waves of suppression had come quickly. Graves's people had already begun to twist the narrative, and the city had begun to quiet again. But there were cracks in the system. People were starting to speak out, to demand answers. The truth was spreading despite the violence and intimidation, and Elijah knew it was time to act. "Are you ready?" Maya's voice broke through his thoughts, her words soft but firm. He turned to her, meeting her gaze for a brief moment before nodding. He didn't have words left. After everything they had been through, this moment was all that mattered, the final move, the last push. Elijah walked to the window, his eyes scanning the streets below. The city felt like a powder keg, waiting to explode. People were angry, they were scared, and the pressure was mounting on Graves's empire, which had begun to crack. But there was one thing Elijah knew for certain. Graves wasn't going to go down without a fight. "We don't have time," Elijah said, turning to Maya. "If we wait any longer, it'll be over. Graves will bury the truth again. We need to strike now." Maya's face hardened with determination, and she nodded. "I'm with you. We do this together." They left the safe house quickly, moving through the back alleys with practiced precision. Elijah had been in situations like this before, but the stakes had never been so high. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something bigger than themselves. The truth, once unleashed, had a life of its own. But it was fragile, and Elijah knew the system would do everything it could to crush it. As they approached the heart of Graves's empire, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Every move they made, every step they took was being watched, but he didn't have a choice. They had come too far. The truth was out, and now they had to make sure it couldn't be erased. "We're almost there," Maya whispered, her voice tight with anticipation. "What's the plan?" Elijah glanced at her, his mind calculating their next move. "We go straight for Graves's office. We expose him in front of the people who still believe in him. We make sure they see the man he really is." They reached the building in the heart of the city, a towering structure that symbolized Graves's power. Inside, behind locked doors, and guarded by men who would kill to protect their boss, was the one man who had built an empire on lies and manipulation. Elijah knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were past the point of negotiation. They were past the point of reasoning. This was war. Elijah moved quietly through the back entrance, his senses on high alert. He had been in more dangerous situations than this, but this time felt different. The weight of everything they had worked for was pressing down on him. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for the truth. As they made their way through the dimly lit corridors, Elijah felt the familiar twinge of old instincts. His body was tense, every step deliberate. He knew Graves had to be close. He could feel it, but as they rounded the corner, they were met with an unexpected sight. Two of Graves's men were waiting for them, standing in the hallway with their guns raised. "Stop right there," one of the men shouted, his finger twitching on the trigger. Elijah didn't hesitate. He had been trained to handle situations like this, and he moved with the precision of a man who had seen too much combat. In a split second, he grabbed the first man's arm, twisting it behind his back, and disarmed him in one fluid motion. The second man hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Elijah's elbow shot out, knocking the man's gun from his hands. Within moments, both men were incapacitated, lying on the cold floor, groaning in pain. Maya didn't say a word. She had been right behind Elijah, her own training kicking in, as she kept watch, making sure they weren't ambushed. But now they had to move faster. Time was running out. They continued forward, moving silently toward Graves's office. The door loomed ahead of them, a symbol of the power Graves held over the city, over everyone who had ever been crushed. By his lies, Elijah's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment where everything would change. They reached the door, and Elijah paused. He glanced at Maya, who nodded, her face filled with the same resolve that he felt. This was the endgame. There was no turning back now. With a swift movement, Elijah kicked the door open. The room was lavishly decorated, with dark wood paneling and expensive art on the walls. But the opulence did nothing to conceal the man sitting behind the desk. Graves, calm and composed, sat with his hands folded, a slight smirk on his face as he looked at them. "You think you've won?" Graves said, his voice cool and controlled. "You've only just begun to understand the game you're playing, Marcus." Elijah stepped forward, his jaw tight with anger. "You've been playing with people's lives for too long, Graves. It ends tonight." Graves leaned back in his chair, unfazed by Elijah's words. "You're just one man, Marcus. You can't take me down. You can't take down the system. The truth you've exposed doesn't matter. I still control this city. I control everything." Elijah's eyes narrowed. Not anymore. Suddenly, the room filled with noise. Gunshots echoed down the hall, followed by the sound of shuffling footsteps. Graves's men had arrived. The building was under siege. "They're here," Maya said, her voice tight. "We have to go." Elijah knew they had no time to waste. The final stand had begun. But as the door behind them burst open and more of Graves' men poured in, Elijah realized that this fight wasn't just about exposure. It was about survival. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting for their lives. Elijah and Maya have reached the final confrontation, but the odds are stacked against them. Graves's empire is collapsing, but will they make it out alive before it does? The system is fighting back harder than ever, and the ultimate cost of their mission is about to be revealed. Will they survive the storm, or will the system crush them before they can finish what they started? Full Chapter 11. The gunshots rang in Elijah's ears, echoing through the corridor like a warning. The door slammed shut behind him, and his heart pounded in his chest as Graves's men poured into the office, their guns raised, their eyes filled with fury. Maya was already moving, ducking behind the desk for cover, her pistol raised. Elijah reacted instinctively, pulling her down with him as bullets slammed into the wall behind them. The room was chaos, a blur of movement and noise, as Graves's men stormed the office. "Stay low," Elijah shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. His eyes scanned the room, calculating their options. There was no way out. Not through the front door, not with Graves's men already closing in. He glanced at Maya, her face set with resolve. She nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. There was no turning back now. They had come too far. "We can't stay here," Maya said, her voice calm even in the midst of the chaos. "We have to get out." But Elijah wasn't sure where they could go. The safe house had been compromised. Every escape route they had planned was now closed off. They were trapped, and the walls were closing in fast. "We're not leaving without the truth," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "We expose Graves here, now." Maya's gaze flickered to the camera on the desk. It was a small, inconspicuous device they had rigged up to record the final piece of evidence, the one that would bring down Graves's empire for good. But Elijah knew that if they didn't act fast, it would all be for nothing. Graves sat in his chair, unbothered by the chaos unfolding around him. He had expected this. He had known it was coming, but now that it was here, he was ready. His empire had been built on lies, manipulation, and violence. But as his men stormed the office, the reality was sinking in. Everything he had worked for was crumbling. "You think you've won?" Graves's voice was calm, almost mocking, as he looked directly at Elijah. "You're just a man, Marcus. You can't take down what's been built over decades." Elijah stared at him, his pulse racing. "You've already lost, Graves. Your empire is exposed. The truth is out, and you can't stop it now." Graves' smirk didn't falter. "The truth? You think that's enough to bring me down? You think the people care about your petty accusations? They'll forget. They always forget." Elijah's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. He had heard it all before. The excuses, the arrogance, it was the same everywhere, with every powerful man who thought they were untouchable. But this time was different. They had exposed Graves's corruption, his ties to the city's elite, and now there was no going back. "You underestimate the people, Graves," Elijah said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "You've had control for too long. But now they know. The truth is out, and you can't erase it." Graves's eyes flickered with something. Doubt, maybe, or fear. But it was fleeting. He recovered quickly, his eyes cold once more. "We'll see about that." The air was thick with tension, the room alive with the sound of gunfire and the clatter of boots on the floor. Graves's men were everywhere, but Elijah wasn't about to back down. Not now, not after everything they had been through. He had fought too hard for this. For the truth, and he wasn't going to let Graves win. He reached for the camera, his fingers brushing the device. It was their last chance. The footage on the camera would be the final nail in Graves's coffin. If they could get it out, if they could make sure the public saw it, the truth would be undeniable. But just as Elijah was about to hit the button, a loud crash sounded from the door. Graves's men were closing in. They had minutes, seconds before the entire building was flooded with more reinforcements. "Do it!" Maya yelled, her voice sharp with urgency. "We can't wait any longer!" Elijah didn't hesitate. He hit the record button and the camera began to film. The footage was everything they had worked for. The final proof of Graves's empire, his deals with the corrupt mayor, his manipulations of the police, and the businesses that had funded his operations. It was all there, in black and white. But as Elijah looked at the camera, something clicked. This wasn't just about the truth anymore. It was about what came next. He knew that even if the footage got out, it wouldn't be enough. Not unless they were willing to do what it took to force the system to change. A sudden noise from the hallway jolted Elijah back to reality. Graves's men were closing in fast. They had no more time to waste. "Go!" Elijah shouted, grabbing Maya's arm. They had to move. They had to get out before they were trapped. But just as they turned to flee, the door slammed open and a group of armed men stormed in. The leader, a tall figure with a scarred face, pointed a gun directly at Elijah. "You've made a mistake, Marcus," the man said, his voice cold and lethal. "You think you can take down Graves? You're nothing." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest as he stared down the barrel of the gun. He had been here before. He had been outnumbered, outgunned. But he wasn't afraid. He had made it this far, and he wasn't going to let Graves win now. "You don't get it," Elijah said, his voice low but steady. "It's already over. You've lost." Before the man could respond, Elijah moved, his body reacting on instinct. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the bullet that rang out. He rolled across the floor, coming up behind cover as the room erupted into chaos. Maya's gunfire filled the air as she returned fire, providing cover for Elijah. "We need to finish this," Elijah said through gritted teeth, his eyes locked on Graves's men. The fight wasn't over, not yet. But they couldn't keep running. They had to take a stand. With a final push, Elijah and Maya fought their way through the office, taking down the guards one by one. But as they reached the door, Elijah's heart dropped. He could hear the sound of sirens in the distance. Graves was calling in every last resource to stop them. "Come on!" Maya yelled, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the exit. "We have to go now." Elijah glanced back at the office, the camera still recording. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about what they had exposed. The truth. And that truth had to make it out, no matter the cost. As Elijah and Maya race to escape the final confrontation, they realize that the truth has already begun to spread. But with Graves' empire closing in on them, the question remains: will they survive long enough to ensure that the truth is heard, or will the system crush them before they can finish what they started? Full Chapter 12. The sirens grew louder, but they didn't stop. They echoed down the narrow alleyways and across the rooftops like the toll of a bell signaling the end. The final act was unfolding and there was no going back. Elijah and Maya ran through the back streets of the city, their footsteps quick and silent, the weight of what they had done settling on their shoulders. The truth was out. The world knew about Graves's corruption, his connections, and the system that had protected him for so long. But the battle wasn't over. Graves's empire was crumbling, but it wasn't going down without a fight. Elijah's mind raced as they ducked into an abandoned building, the damp, musty air hitting them as they pushed through the door. Every step felt heavier than the last. His thoughts were a blur of adrenaline, fear, and something else, something darker. He had exposed Graves. He had exposed the system. But at what cost? As they moved through the dark corridors of the building, Maya looked at him, her eyes filled with the same exhaustion he felt. "We're not safe, Elijah. They're closing in. They won't stop until we're dead." "I know," Elijah replied, his voice steady. He wasn't going to let fear control him now, not after everything they had been through. "But we're not going down without a fight." The building was empty, quiet, save for the sounds of their breathing and the distant rumble of police cars closing in. They had to move quickly. The information they had exposed had ignited something bigger than Graves's empire. The people were rising, demanding answers, but Graves was a man who would kill to protect his power. Elijah knew that. But now he was fighting not just for survival, but for something bigger than himself. "We need to make sure the footage gets out," Maya said, her voice a low whisper as she pulled out her phone. "We can't let Graves bury this." Elijah nodded, his eyes scanning the room. The final video, the one that would bring everything crashing down, was their last card. But even as they tried to send it out, Elijah felt the pressure of the moment. The walls were closing in. They couldn't keep running. They had to finish this. "The people deserve the truth," Elijah said, his voice firm with resolve. "Graves won't win this. Not now. Not after everything we've done." A sudden noise from the hallway stopped him. Elijah's muscles tensed, every instinct in his body alert. He reached for his gun, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "It's them," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have much time." The door to the building creaked open, and Elijah knew that this was it. Graves's men had found them. There was no more time for hiding, no more time for running. They moved quickly, ducking into a dark corner of the building. Elijah could hear the footsteps growing louder, the sound of men searching for them, their voices harsh and demanding. They had to move fast. The truth had to be heard. Maya's phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it. "It's out," she said, her voice filled with both relief and fear. "The footage is everywhere. The people know. It's too late for Graves." Elijah didn't respond. He was too focused on the sound of approaching footsteps, on the realization that the final stand was here. They had come so far, but now it wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about surviving long enough for the truth to change the world. The door slammed open, and Elijah and Maya were forced into the open. Graves's men filled the doorway, guns drawn, their eyes cold and ruthless. But Elijah stood tall, unyielding, even as his mind raced for a way out. "You think you've won, don't you?" One of Graves's men sneered, his gun aimed at Elijah's chest. "You think you can take down everything we've built? You're nothing." Elijah's heart pounded, but his gaze never wavered. "I'm not fighting for myself. I'm fighting for the truth. And that's something you can't stop." The man laughed, the sound low and mocking. "Truth? You're nothing but a rat in a trap. Graves is untouchable." Elijah's jaw tightened. "No one's untouchable." Before Graves's men could react, Elijah moved. He lunged, his body a blur of movement, his training taking over. In a split second, he disarmed the man closest to him, sending the gun flying. The room erupted into chaos, gunfire filling the air. Elijah and Maya moved in tandem, a dance of survival, their bodies working in perfect sync as they took down Graves's men one by one. But the more they fought, the more Elijah felt the weight of the situation. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who had been silenced by Graves's system, for every victim, for every soul crushed by the power that had been abused for so long. "Get to the roof," Elijah shouted to Maya, his voice urgent. "We need to make sure the truth gets out. We can't stop now." Maya didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the stairs, her footsteps light and quick. Elijah followed, his mind focused on the task at hand. But as they reached the roof, he felt the pressure building again. This was the last stand. There was no turning back. They reached the edge of the rooftop, looking out over the city. Graves's men were closing in, but Elijah's resolve remained unshaken. He pulled out his phone, sending a final message, a message to the people. The footage, the truth, the system that had protected men like Graves had to be brought down. As he hit send, he turned to Maya, his eyes filled with the weight of what they had accomplished. They had exposed Graves. They had exposed the system, and the world was watching. But just as the message went out, Elijah heard the telltale sound of footsteps behind him. Graves had arrived. "Elijah," Graves said, his voice cold and filled with contempt. "You think you've won? This city is mine. You can't take it down. You can't take me down." Elijah turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "You're wrong, Graves. The people know now. They're not afraid of you anymore." Graves's eyes flickered with something, doubt maybe, or fear, but it was brief. He stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You'll regret this." Elijah didn't flinch. "I already have. But the people deserve the truth." The final confrontation was brutal, a battle of wills as much as it was of survival. But as the fight wore on, Elijah realized something. This wasn't just about taking down Graves. It was about taking down the system that had allowed him to rise. It was about changing the world, and as the final blow was struck, Elijah knew one thing for certain. The fight for justice had only just begun. The final stand has ended. But the revolution is far from over. Elijah and Maya have exposed Graves's empire. But will the system allow them to win? The truth is out, but the battle is only just beginning. Will Elijah survive the storm, or will the system crush him before he can finish what he started?